like the one here from 1932. And this is the last one, the most recent one by Dr. Dame Maggie Aderin-Polk, titled A Voyage Through Time and Space. Here is the latest in the Fermi Lab lecture series, At the Edge of Time, exploring the mysteries of our universe's first seconds. And you can see that there was a lot of interest in it, and a full house, as well as what we have here. And we are very glad that all of you could find time for this event in your schedule. We started this in 2015. So in 2015, we had the first lecture titled The Unusual Rheology of Concentrated Suspensions. And the speaker was Morton Den from the City College of New York. A year later, Thomas Russell was here speaking about breaking Moore's Law. David Kaplan from Tufts University came the next year to speak about engineered silk proteins for regenerative medicine. And in 2018, Karen Worsley was here from Texas A&M speaking about functional polymer materials designed for advanced application and sustainability. As you can see, we have now quite a record. Juan de Pablo came to NJIT to speak about liquid crystals, and Frank Bates followed it with 2021, interfacial rheology, from beer foams to materials design. 2023, we missed 1 year because of the pandemic. Frontiers in Supermolecular Design Materials by Samuel Stupp. 2024, the last one, was Yuri Gogotsi from Drexel University. 2D carbides and nitrates are ready to roll. And with that, let me invite Professor Piero Armenante back to the podium to introduce the 2025 Marino Xanthos Memorial Lecture.
Thank you, Ditka. It's really an honor to be here to introduce today's speaker, to his lecture. Dean Kam already provided some information about the origin of this year's lecture and the fact that it was entitled to Marino, a colleague of mine, what beloved colleague of mine in our department. So now we have quite a track, as you saw, in terms of distinguished lectures that came to address this audience. And you can see already that there's significant interest because this room is already very full. So today's speaker, as I mentioned many times now, is Professor Howard Stone of Princeton University. Professor Stone asked me to be somewhat brief in my remarks, although I could probably go for some time just to citing his accomplishment. If he's in this list, it's because he is accomplished, and you will see this yourself. And if you read the vita that is condensed here, you will know more about it. I'll just mention to you that Professor Stone is the Neil Ullman 1968 Professor of Mechanical Aerospace Engineers, although he's a chemical engineer by training, but he's in a mechanical aerospace engineering department at Princeton. He got his PhD from Caltech and then joined different universities, including Harvard and now Princeton. He is very interested in the application of fluid dynamics to many different fields. And again, he spanned across usually Reynolds number applications to a variety of fields. And he is not only an accomplished researcher. He asked me not to mention how many publications he has. I'll just say that they're in the hundreds. And the H index is above 100. I only mentioned that. You can check yourself. And how many references he has. But that's just a very accomplished scholar. I'll just allow me to give one more data point. I think in 2016, he had 56 papers 1 year that most of us don't get number of years, if at all. He received a number of awards that I will not mention, but other than maybe one or two, and these awards are the one that he received for education, not just research. He has research awards, of course, but also education awards, which is a proof that people can be a good researcher and excellent instructor and teachers. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, National Academy of Science, American Academy of Arts and Science, among others. And he had been awarded a number of prizes. I will only mention the last one. Well, one of the many, excuse me, the Fluid Mechanic Prize, the American Physical Society, as well as the Bachelor's Award, which is a recognition of people who contributed significantly to the field of fluid mechanics. I think I said enough. I think it's now for me to introduce today's speaker. So please welcome Professor Howard Alvin Stone to the podium.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being patient while we got started today. If I stand here, can you hear me? Okay. So we'll get started. I first want to thank NJIT. I want to thank the Newark College of Engineering, and I want to thank the people who spent time with me today, including very good friends in the audience. It's really special to be here and have this chance. So I'm going to tell you a little about fluid mechanics. The way I'm going to do it is I'm first going to thank my research group. The pictures include significant others and things like that, but the people responsible for the ideas that I get to share are the people around me, and I think like all of us who have research groups, we're very lucky to get to work with the people we do. Okay, so I want to acknowledge the family of Marino Xanthos, and you've heard a little about him and his work in polymers, and because of that, I changed the very end of my talk because in some of the papers he mentioned rheology. In the last few years, I've worked a little on this topic of rheology. There's sort of an existing puzzle in rheology, and I'm going to mention it at the end of my talk. So if you came here because I wrote in an abstract something about biological condensates, write me an email. Okay, so here are the goals for the talk. You can leave anytime you want, but the goals. I want to convince you that fluid mechanics is beautiful. Okay, that's item one. I want to convince you that it's interesting, even if you think it might not be interesting. I want to kind of share with you the idea that, like many subjects, it's a great way to enter the fields of science and engineering. And finally, I want to believe, and I want to share with you why I believe that it's important because of many problems that face society today. There are a lot of images, there are only a few equations, and hopefully there are ideas that you find interesting. Okay, so to start, I'm going to tell you why fluid mechanics is interesting, why it matters, and then this might be old-fashioned in the era of ChatGPT, but I like an intellectual concept called self-similarity, and so I'm going to share with you, largely through pictures, but also through a few equations, why the concept of self-similarity is relevant, and I'll try to convince you that. I won't have time to do everything on this slide. And then at the end, there's a little puzzle in the field of rheology that we've stumbled on, and I'm going to share that with you. So this is sort of the outline, okay? So here's how we start. I happen to stumble into the field of fluid mechanics. I find it fascinating. I think you should too, okay? So question one, where do you see fluid mechanics in this slide? Well, okay, so you see it in the atmosphere, in the oceans, in the weather, in the climate. You see it at every scale. Of course, if you look inside the Earth, you also have fluid mechanics if you're a geoscientist, because of the interior of the Earth is in motion, and that drives motion of the continental plate. So just this image tells you some of the interest that your colleagues might have, even if you don't have in fluid mechanics questions. Where do you see fluid mechanics in this slide? I think this is relevant. Okay, I want to be careful how I say this. I once visited a university. On the walk down the stairs with my host, a student was walking up the stairs. The student stopped and said to my colleague, "Hello, Professor so-and-so." My colleague said, "Well, who are you?" The student said, "Oh, I'm in your fluid mechanics class." So I said to the student, "What do you think about it?" And the student, after it's the end of the semester, said, "Oh, I don't know. It seems okay. I just don't know what it's useful for." And I thought of all the classes that you could possibly take at a university, which has all the images that it does. How could that be the response? Anyway, so where do you see fluid mechanics? And I would say, well, you see it lots of places. Blood flow, you breathe, you urinate, you cry, the sweat you have, mucus that keeps you healthy when you get sick. So many places. And the consequence of that is we have to think how the fluid flows. And so the vasculature is important. Whether you have a heart condition is important. The way doctors use stents to assist you, they delivery of medicine. And the consequence of it is this also means that many biological problems will link to fluid mechanics. You know, for example, here's one. Swimming microorganisms. I don't know if this is going to play, but it's not going to. When you see the microorganisms like E. coli swim, they swim because they have a flagella that moves them in a straight line. But when E. coli is on the right, swimming near a surface, they swim in circles. And you could ask, well, why would they swim in circles? And that's because they see the wall through the fluid that they're swimming in, and that changes the trajectory they have. These are all fluid mechanics questions. The scale of this question is a few microns, 10 to the minus 6 meters. The scale of the Earth is 10 to the 6 meters. The ratio of those two numbers is 10 to the 12. And the miracle of fluid mechanics is the same equations describe both problems, if you know how to think about it. Airplane flight, you take for granted. Just a few years ago, the first flight occurred on a different planet, the flight of Ingenuity on Mars. And so you can see, you can get online if this movie plays. The first flight of a vehicle in the low density and the low gravity of another planet. I guess you'll have to watch it online. Sorry about that. I mentioned to you the vasculature of humans. All organisms have vasculature. So I'm fortunate to get to work with two amazing colleagues in Amsterdam, Toby Kears and Tom Shimizu, who study fluid flow that occurs underground. Since it's underground, you don't see it. Very few people have seen it. What you see above ground is, you know, that water flows from the ground up to the tree and then evaporates at the leaves. Photosynthesis happens. Oh, I see. Oh, my dog. How'd my dog get there? What happened? What happened? The dog's name is Eiffel, by the way, named after a good engineer. Okay, so I was telling you about vasculature. Here's vasculature in the human body. Here's vasculature in a living organism, a plant. The water goes up. The water goes up the tree. Photosynthesis happens in the leaves. Sugar goes down the tree. But underground, there's a living network of fungi that allow plants to get nutrients from the soil. The plants trade with the fungi trade with the plants to get carbon so that they can grow. And this comes up in an estimate is something like 80% of all agriculture relies on these underground things that transport fluids that no one ever sees. And if you look inside them, and Toby and Tom have built a microscope and a robot to do this. If you look inside the vasculature, so this is at the scale of 10 microns. If you play the movie, I don't know where that came from. If you play the movie, what you'll see is that unlike ordinary fluid motion, which is unidirectional in a pipe, the flow in the fungi is bidirectional. It goes both directions because it relies on both a pressure difference as well as molecular motors that walk along the walls. And so lots of fluid mechanics questions you have to re-ask because the driving force is different in the vasculature of these systems, and I'm fortunate enough to get to work with Philippe Henrique on this. Okay, so that's the vasculature. We all lived through COVID. COVID, of course, was a terrible situation we lived through, but there was a fluid mechanics component, which is that it was a disease, a virus transmitted through the air, not through coughing, as many talks would say, but just through ordinary activities that put an aerosol that remained in the room for a long time. I was fortunate that at the time of COVID, I was being visited by a colleague, Manuk Abkarian, and he went to the lab and we imaged what happens when you speak. And this video, if it plays, you'll see that there's a person on the right. He's going to just speak a very simple phrase. In this case, he speaks, Peter Piper picked a peck, because the sound P is a plosive and produces a vortical structure at your mouth. I don't know if you, I guess the movie won't play. Oh, there it's playing. To make clear, remember when COVID started, the World Health Organization, sort of supported by the CDC, said stand 2 meters apart. These World Health Organization said a meter. The horizontal distance here is almost a meter. The time running in the corner will run up to a 1 second. So as soon as you speak, within a very short time, the material in your mouth has traveled in front of you easily a meter or two. So we were able to study that with my research group, and many people have studied it, and we made fluid mechanical analogies to this problem. Just to give you a flavor of what we've been doing since, is we've been trying to build in the way people speak into a fluid mechanical simulator of effectively solving the Navier-Stokes equations for the airflow coming out of your mouth as you speak. And to give you a flavor of this, this is with Junshi Wang at Princeton. We take information available on the web for how you move your lips and teeth and tongue. We build that into the air that exits your mouth through your lips and your teeth. And then we combine that with the Navier equations because we measure the airflow rate. And so now we can roughly take a phrase, in this case, calculate for you the airflow that leaves, as you say, simple phrases, and figure out if it goes up or down and how far it goes as you're speaking. This would be an example of a fluid mechanical feature of not sound, but the contamination that you produce in front of you when you're having a conversation. Okay, that's just an example. These are just velocity contours or vorticity contours. Yeah, sound is a much higher frequency effect, so we don't try and do acoustics. We're trying to just say what happens when you're communicating and the air around you contains the air that came out of you. Okay, so if you don't think fluid mechanics is interesting yet, how about this? You look at this shorebird. The shorebird, when it gets hungry, spins in circles. Okay? It spins in circles because it's hungry, so it doesn't like to get its head wet, and it pecks at the surface. So you're allowed to ask, what's the shorebird doing? Why does it spin in circles when it's hungry? And the answer? By spinning in circles, it creates a vortex in the water. The vortex has in it an upflow, so it doesn't have to dive into the water. It just has to peck at the surface. Okay, so in interest of full disclosure, where's Anand? Is Anand here? Okay, Anand is a student of John Bush, who was my first graduate student, and he's a professor at MIT, important person. He gave a talk in front of 1,000 people at an American Physical Society's meeting. At the end of the talk, there were no questions. That upsets me usually. But he had shown this video for a different reason. And so I stood up and I asked, does the video of the shorebird mean that the shorebird knows more fluid mechanics than we do? And he said in front of 1,000 people, I can't speak for everyone in the room, but I can assure you the shorebird knows more about fluid mechanics than my PhD advisor. Okay, if you like hard alcohol or a glass of wine and you want to know something about the so-called wine tears or legs in a glass of wine. It's a beautiful fluid mechanical phenomena. It's associated with the name Marangoni phenomena, which has to do with gradients of surface tension. And although it's associated with this name of Marangoni, who was a late 19th century Italian physicist, the first study of the problem is due to a man named James Thomson, who you haven't heard of, but you've heard of his older brother, who was Lord Kelvin. Okay? But now you're supposed to ask a question. If his name was James Thomson, why Kelvin? Why was his older brother named Lord Kelvin? And that's an important question because that's the origin of our temperature scale. So where the heck did that come from? Yeah. So the answer is William Thomson, when made a lord, needed a name. So he looked outside his house at the River Kelvin that was in Kelvinside in Scotland, and he chose the name from the name of the river that ran outside his home. Okay, so that's the, so you learned a little history, if not, even if you don't like fluid mechanics. Okay, all right, so I mentioned in my title a bifurcation. Here's something that's a very ordinary flow. If you teach mechanics, you teach things like this in an undergraduate textbook, which is that there are lots of piping situations, whether they're in industry, whether they're in their laboratory, whether they're inside you. There are lots of places where the flow has to branch and has to come in one place and split. And this looks completely boring, doesn't it? Okay, so you might ask, what could possibly be learned about this? And I'm going to claim that we discovered something new about the Navier-Stokes equations, one of the most well-studied problems in science and engineering. And it started with just flow in this ordinary T-shape, where the flow is going to come in at the top and out at the sides. We're going to work at a Reynolds number that's large, but not necessarily fully turbulent. And if you just have rigid particles, and I don't know if this movie will play, if you just have rigid particles, they come in at the top and they go out the sides. If you can play the movie, you'll see that the flow looks pretty boring. The particles follow streamlines. You don't see that right now because it's not playing. Oh, there you go. Play the movie. There you go. And we were first studying this because we were interested in how particles might interact or hit the wall and damage the coating of a wall. And one day, you can see it's pretty boring, right? Flow comes in, particles leave, whatever. Okay, so one day air bubbles got trapped in this experiment. So if you play the movie, again, the flow comes in at the top, it goes out at the sides, but when you look at this over a few seconds, this is a high-speed movie, what you see is that the bubbles aren't all leaving, they're actually accumulating in the middle of the pipe. If you're a quantitative person, a nonlinear dynamics person, and you just use your hands to sketch the streamlines, you would call the middle an unstable stagnation point because everything should go away from it if you just made a two-dimensional sketch. And in fact, of course, that's exactly the wrong answer. And so we got to interested in why, and so we did full numerical simulations for this problem. A man named Stefan Radl was the first one to do it with us. And as you increase the flow speed, which is increasing the Reynolds number, the flow gets progressively more complicated, and the yellow part just indicates regions of high vorticity. And what you discover about this problem, by making this very systematic graph, what you discover is that near the Reynolds number of 600, the flow has a change in topology. And by that I mean, if you sketch the streamlines, there's a place inside the flow where the velocity becomes zero. In other words, there's an internal stagnation point, and you end up with what looks to be 4 vortices. One of them has an internal sequence of closed streamlines, which fluid mechanicians historically call vortex breakdown. And it's the reason why low density bubbles, if they get trapped in here, can't escape. And low density objects always go to the center of vortices. So if you were to play this movie again, what you would discover is that this three-dimensional flow that gets created in a very simple geometry allows this bifurcation to occur above a critical Reynolds number. Anyways, that's just an example of an unusual flow situation in a very simple geometry. Okay, I'm not sure where I am in my introduction, but I think I finished my introduction. I tried to say why fluid mechanics is interesting and a whole slew of problems that for someone trained in fluid mechanics, they look similar. Okay, they're not identical, but it gives you a language to talk to people about a wide range of problems. And well, you guys asked me to give the talk. That's why I find fluid mechanics interesting. Okay, so I also find the concept of self-similarity interesting. So I'm going to try to tell you something about this concept and motivate why asking questions is an interesting thing to do. So if someone said to you, what's similarity? What you might, if you're walking down the streets of Newark and someone says, what do you mean by similarity? What would you say? Well, maybe you draw similar triangles and try to convince them that the three angles are the same, independent of the lengths of the sides. You could shrink or grow one of the triangles to look exactly like the other. On the other hand, if you teach a class and you teach a class about diffusion or mass transfer, you would write a diffusion equation. And I realize that many people would first solve the equation, but what you might first do is just make a sketch and say, if I had a quantity of some concentration C diffusing, and it began at one boundary, like the wall, at some concentration, and then it had to diffuse away to zero concentration far away, you might sketch the concentration profile at different times as something was diffusing. And self-similarity is simply the idea that all these curves are really the same curve in disguise. They're just the curve that you get if instead of plotting C versus position at different times, you plot X divided by the square root of dt. And then they become all the same curve. That's the sort of the concept of something being self-similar. If you want to read about it, I give a few examples here at the bottom. If you're in a quantitative field, what I want you to take away is if the description has two independent variables, then the self-similar idea takes a partial differential equation in two variables and effectively makes it an ordinary differential equation in a single variable. Okay, so the way this starts in fluid mechanics is there are lots of equations of this type that look diffusive-like, but they're nonlinear. They can have other things in them. If you're semi-quantitative and you want to take one idea away, it's if you see equations of this type, you can also often do something with pencil and paper. You don't need the computer to get a quantitative idea. Okay, and there are lots of examples of this in science and engineering where the solution looks like t to a power times a function of a ratio, and finding the exponents alpha and beta becomes what you're trying to do to learn something. And there are many examples of this, and they often have analyses and experiments. I'm going to show you one, okay? I'm going to fill in the other side after, because I'm going to show you something that's not typically in textbooks, that's different than this. Okay, so if you like, pancakes on Sunday morning, an example of a problem with a similarity solution is you spill a viscous liquid on a surface, you watch it spread out, and you plot radius versus time. And if you did that, if you plotted radius on the vertical, don't worry about the small print. This is just from the paper by Herbert Huppert. If you plot radius versus time on a log-log graph, the spreading happens slowly. So here's in seconds, 100 seconds, 1,000 seconds, an hour, a day, a week. He took a long time experiment. But the amazing thing is on a log-log graph, all the data falls on a line with slope 1/8. That's the signature of something that's self-similar. There are lots of examples in fluid mechanics that have the feature that they're a thin film. They come in many examples. Okay, so here's one that is relatively new. Oh, I have to tell you, I have one slide with math. Okay, the Navier-Stokes equations are a complicated set of equations involving a velocity and a density and a pressure. Okay, so the way you write them in a class is for an incompressible flow, if u is the velocity, here's the Navier-Stokes equations. The miracle of this problem is that when you have a geometry that's long and narrow, so what a fluid mechanician would call thin, what they really mean is if you have a shape that I like to call H, if that shape has a small slope,
then this equation you can rationally simplify. People like Linda Cummings and others in the audience are experts at this. And the rational simplification says that instead of solving the continuity equation for the velocity, you solve an equation for the height. And this is true of almost any conservation principle. But to use it to find the height, you need the velocity. This symbol just means in the plane parallel to the boundary. So you turn to the Navier-Stokes equations and you say, if the geometry is thin, the flow is slow, so you get rid of the left-hand side. Then this might offend mathematicians, but you get rid of all the derivatives by saying you have a frictionally dominated flow. That's the Darcy approximation. And the upshot of this is you get one equation for the shape. It's complicated, but it's only one equation for a scalar function, and it has all the physical concepts. It has a viscous effect through the viscosity. It has surface tension through this parameter gamma. The surface tension involves all the curvature of the interface. It has a gravity term. If you're an elastician, there's a term that you add to this that involves even more derivatives. And it's one equation, and it's a second order equation when you have gravity, and it's a fourth order equation when you have surface tension, but it encapsulates many problems. So that's the short story. How am I doing time-wise, by the way? I have no idea. Okay, keep going. Okay, so here's the problem I want to tell you about. This problem was first identified in the 1990s. It was made popular by David Carré and coworkers about 10 years ago. And the first analysis was a few years ago by Massoud Doi, who's a famous name in condensed matter physics. The idea is you just take a cylinder, you take a cylinder and you place it against a wall, and then you put a little liquid at the bottom of the cylinder. And if the liquid is wetting, it wants to rise up the narrow gap between the cylinder and the wall. Okay, now you might think that the fluid just rises up a finite height, but it turns out that's not true. It turns out that the fluid, when it rises up the gap between the cylinder and the wall, and here there's a gap on both sides, it rises continuously. It slows down as it rises, but the rise height as a function of time varies as t to the 1/3. It just keeps going so long as you're above the scale of a molecule. And so the question is, why? Or can you describe it? Can you write down a solution that helps you understand this? And you might think that this solution should depend on the shape of the geometry. So we looked into that. And so we tried to study this problem to try to understand what features of this problem are completely universal and what parts depend on the shape. Okay, one slide of math. Okay, so the way this goes is you have to describe the fluid that sits in narrow geometry. And so here's sort of the fluid going up the narrow geometry, and it goes up because there's a meniscus here that's curved. And so if you were to ask yourself what's true between air and a liquid, because a wetting liquid has a curved meniscus, the pressure is, don't know what's going on. That was pretty exciting. Let's see if it comes back. The pressure in the liquid is low, that's why the fluid's going up. And so we set this up to ask, what happens if you have two cylinders next to each other, and you want to say what the curvature of the meniscus is? If you had two things that were curved, if they were quadratic in shape, the height profile would look like x squared. If it was a wedge, it would look like the power x. If it was flattened, it would look like something else. We wrote down a generic law that has one funny thing with dimensions, and x to the power n, you get to choose n depending on the shape of the gap. What I'm not going to tell you is that the rise height doesn't really care about the shape, and I'm going to now justify what that means. So if you write down a differential equation for the fluid that rises along the gap, it has the following feature. Oh, it involves this parameter we call the radius of curvature. It involves one thing with funny dimensions that depends on whatever shape you have. And when you write down an equation for this problem, it's effectively the continuity equation that asks, what's the time rate of change of cross-sectional area? Then this derivative is telling you what's the rate of change of a flux, and the flux involves a gravity term, which comes in through what's called the capillary length, the ratio of surface tension to gravity, and it involves also the change of the curvature as you go up. The funny thing is, when you write down this equation, is the parameter c disappears. It appears in every term and it goes away, which tells you that the geometry has a funny feature. The choice of the geometry doesn't matter, and the only thing that enters this equation is n, which is telling you how curved the geometry is. I said n equal 1 is a wedge, n equal 2 is a curve. So if you make this equation non-dimensional, which sort of for me is like religion, but I realize it's not so popular anymore, but if you make this equation non-dimensional, then even all the physical variables go away, and the only thing that remains is n. So the claim is now, when you solve this problem, there must be a universal solution, and the only thing that can affect it at all is the parameter that tells you about the shape of the gap. Nothing else matters. No other length scale matters, no other time scale matters. And the consequence of it is, when you analyze this equation, ask Yuan or someone in the audience, they would show you that the only solution allowed has time to the 1/3 in it. And so we did some experiments where you measure rise height versus time. You try to make them all non-dimensional, and basically they become a universal curve. The universal curve agrees with the analytical solution, and the only parameter that can possibly affect this is this number n, which tells you about the local shape. And the embarrassing or sad thing about this is that it's only weakly dependent on n. If you change n from a wedge to something else, it only affects the prefactor in this law. It doesn't affect anything else. So anyways, that's an example of self-similarity. Okay, maybe you'll find this one more interesting. Let's suppose you like this idea of thin film. So I showed you this left-hand side, which is from courses. I'm now going to ask you not about a problem with 2 variables like x and t. I'm going to ask you about one with 3 variables. I'm going to ask you, could you ever have a similarity solution? If you did, could you solve the resulting equation? And are there experiments that at all have this feature? So the answer to every question is going to be yes. So it goes like this. Suppose I give you, I wet a wall and I watch a film drain. This is a very old fluid mechanics problem called the Jeffrey problem. So you take a fluid, you put it on a wall, and you ask your friend, as gravity drains the film, how does the height change both with position and time? And Jeffrey looked at this, and he wrote down an equation that said the film height h changes with position along the film and time according to this equation. Okay, if you're a graduate student and you take an applied math class, your professor will tell you that this is a first order nonlinear PDE, partial differential equation, and you have to solve that by method of characteristics. Okay, how many of you have heard of that? Okay, what they don't tell you is that this problem you can solve by algebra. So you erase the derivatives, and you see by inspection that h squared is proportional to x over t. And it turns out that's an exact solution to this problem. Here. And that solution is called the Jeffrey solution, that this function is an exact solution of this PDE. It looks like, it's called a similarity solution because it involves the 2 independent variables as a ratio, and it involves their square root. So I'm going to call that the Jeffrey problem. It tells you how a film thickness changes. Okay, so now what about this experiment? You take a surface, you wet it. The surface has a finite thickness, and you watch the film drain, and you see it drain because of the different colors. So if I were to ask you, what do you study about this problem? I will first tell you that the world's fluid mechanicians for basically 100 years look at the middle of the film, because that's where it's supposed to be uniform, and they measure film thickness versus time to check the Jeffrey solution. But what's the most interesting feature of the experiment? the edges are the most interesting feature. So I'm going to tell you about the edges, but first I'm going to tell you about the middle because that's a Jeffrey problem. And then I'm going to tell you what's happening at the edge. Okay, so this problem goes like this. You do something to measure the film thickness. When you measure the film thickness, you can reconstruct the film height, and that goes like this. You stand at 3 different locations I'll call X. You measure the film height as a function of time at any position. You do it for different viscosities, and here I've done it for 3 X's, and you get 6 curves. By the way, this is what people standard do when they do experiments or numerics or whatever. But the point is, Jeffrey teaches us that maybe these are all related curves because Jeffrey suggests the solution is the square root. So it turns out if you rescale the height by the Jeffrey solution, all the curves are a universal curve. That's the spirit of self-similarity. Okay? All right, so now you do it for this problem. You look at the edge. So I'm going to tell you what happens when you walk vertically along the film, you walk horizontally from the edge, and you try to measure film thickness. So if you stand at this location X and you measure film thickness versus Y, you get this curve at some time. Now you pick a different X and you measure the curve. So now there are 3 curves. Okay, this is film thickness as a function of position. Okay, now you change the viscosity and you do it at different times. So now there are 12 curves. And now you ask, are they possibly related? Or do you just have to live with the fact that this is a complicated problem? Okay, so we did the following thing. Again, I'm just slightly nervous about time. Okay, well, it's close. Okay, so there's roughly this funny shape. It's thick near the edge. It's uniform in the middle. You write down an equation. This equation is a relative of the one I told you about. It has a viscous effect, a surface tension effect, and a gravity effect. And the first and the last term are the Jeffrey problem. Okay? That's what I tried to teach you. Now there's an edge effect, and the edge effect brings in all the high derivatives because the system's curved. All right, so this is a, if you like this term, very nonlinear equation. I don't know what the very means in very nonlinear. Certainly, okay. And it turns out now a miracle happens. The miracle is there's an exact solution to this equation. And the exact solution you get by learning, using a trick you learn in fluid mechanics when you study boundary layers, is you say the film thickness should look like the Jeffrey solution when I get away from the edge. And you try to correct it by a function that depends on a similarity variable that involves all 3 independent variables, y, x, and t. And it turns out if you substitute this guess into the PD partial differential equation, you can identify this funny variable that miraculously involves 3 independent variables, y, x, and t, and all the physical variables, mu, gamma, and rho. And the consequence of it is you can check this against the experiment. And so I showed you this graph with 12 different curves. You now rescale the vertical by the Jeffrey solution, and you rescale the horizontal by what's called the similarity variable, and these all become a single curve. And so you've deconstructed this edge problem, which I think comes up many places, though I'm searching for other problems of this type, that have this thin film feature near edges. Okay, in the interest of time, let me just do this for you. We've looked at self-similarity in other problems. There's some people from math here. We've looked at problems that have this wine tears effect that's called surfactant spreading. In math, you learn about a famous equation in the literature called the Burger's equation. These topics, it turns out, are related. And this has been studied by my colleague, Fernando Temprano-Coleto. And so I just want to point out to you what the problem is. If you take a contaminant and you put it on the surface of water, the contaminant changes the surface tension. So this first thing they've done is put a little powder on. Now you add a contaminant. The contaminant changes the surface tension and the liquid spreads. That spreading is called the Marangoni effect. Suppose you want to study it. Okay, what we stumbled on is that this is a very rich literature. And let me just leave you with the basic idea. We got interested in studying this problem with a deep fluid. We did it in 2 dimensions, and we imagine there's a region near the middle where you did what the experimentalist did, deposit a small amount of surfactant on a small length scale, and then the system spreads itself. It turns out if you try to write down equations for this problem, you have to write down an equation for a quantity that's transported along the surface. You call that the surface density capital gamma. But in order to solve this equation, you need the velocity along the surface, but the velocity depends on gamma. And in this problem, they're related by an integral. To get the surface velocity at any point, you need the whole integral of the surface distribution. For the math people in the audience, the miracle of this problem, which had already been identified by Darren Crowdy and Andreas Thess and a few others, is that these 2 coupled problems, when combined, lead to the Burger's equation. The Burger's equation is a partial differential equation for a given variable. And in this problem, if you view this variable as a complex variable, its real part is the surface velocity, its imaginary part is the surface concentration. And what we then did is point out that there's similarity solutions to this problem that one can study. Okay, so I'll just leave you with that. There's far too many details. I'll skip that. If you're interested, talk to me after. I just want to leave by trying to link to Marino Xanthos. Professor Xanthos was an expert on polymer flows. I'm not an expert on polymer flows, but for the last few years, we've gotten interested in the subject of rheology. And it turns out in the subject of rheology, as we understand it, there's an unusual sort of embarrassing feature in the field, which is that when people do a certain kind of common experiment and they compare with simulations, they don't agree. And the field refers to this as the discrepancy. And it's a case for steady flows. Okay, so here's what they do. Oops, okay. You take any kind of configuration that has what we will call a constriction, and you study what the pressure drop is across the constriction for a given flow rate, okay? This could be your blocked blood vessel. This could be something in a porous system. It doesn't matter what the constriction looks like. When you make a plot of the pressure change that occurs and you normalize it by what would occur with a Newtonian fluid of the same viscosity, the experimental curve as a function of flow rate, which is here called the dimensionless Deborah number, the experimental data all shows a monotonic increase, and then it reaches a quasi-steady state. The simulations based on the standard so-called constitutive equations for polymer solutions, one called Oldroyd B, the other called the finitely extendable nonlinear elastic model, shows a constant start and then it decreases. And so there's this difference between simulation and experiment that's called the discrepancy. I learned about this 3 or 4 years ago, and being interested in it, I was 99% sure that the problem was the simulations. After all, what else could it be? They have to make assumptions to do simulations, and they're clearly not picking the right assumptions. This is generic, by the way. If you have what's called a contraction, whether it's sharp or smooth, you also get this discrepancy, and when the flow is steady. So starting about 6 months ago, working with my postdoc, Dan Hu, and graduate student Zhang Wang, and my colleague Evgeny Boyko, we started to realize that maybe the problem wasn't the simulations. Maybe the problem was the way people interpret the experiments. So we've redone all the experiments in this topic, and there's an idea in textbooks in fluid mechanics, which is that when you have flow in a channel and you have a polymeric material, if the streamlines curve, the polymer exerts what's referred to as an elastic stress on the fluid. Okay, so what does this mean? You go to Amazon and you buy what's called a pressure sensor, and you place the pressure sensor on a pipe there's a little cavity and the pressure sensor sits up here. We refer to that as a recessed pressure sensor. Sorry for the extra S. What you measure by the sensor, by the pressure sensor, is not the pressure. You measure the normal force on the sensor, which has a contribution from the fluid and from the fact that the polymer solution has curved streamlines. If you compare it with a flush sensor at the bottom, you get, by the flush sensor, you get the actual pressure in the fluid. This was first studied in the 1960s. It's called the hole pressure error in the literature. We refer to it more as the hole pressure effect. And our conclusion, and I'll just point this out, we've now done experiments that go like this. You measure the pressure difference in the flow. In the blue symbols, you measure it with a recessed pressure sensor, and the pressure difference rises. That's what I showed you at the beginning. If you measure it with a flush pressure sensor, the yellow curves are below the blue curves, and they're below the prediction of a Newtonian fluid. If you make this so-called, non-dimensional curve, where you plot the pressure difference relative to the value for a Newtonian fluid, the recessed data all goes up, the flush sensor data all goes down. I should say the flush sensor data is in agreement with simulations, and our reading of the literature is that, as far as we can tell, in the experimental literature that report data of this type, they generally have not corrected their measurements for the polymeric effect and the, okay, now I have to be diplomatic how to say this, the field of theory and simulation people who have done work and then done a comparison also haven't read the papers carefully enough to identify that the experimentalists probably didn't correct their data for this physical effect. So our conclusion is that there is no discrepancy in the field. What there is a misunderstanding between the simulation people and the experimental people. I have some other things I can say, but in the interest of time, I think I'll stop and I'll just try to share with you. I've tried to convince you that, or at least tell you a story about how fluid mechanics can be interesting. I tried to pick a few little points to get you to think differently or at least quantitatively about a few flows, and I tried to point out a few problems. I realize I've run on a little long, it's late, but I want to say thank you again, especially to the audience to visit, and Piero for being a great host.
You didn't disappoint. I don't think you disappoint anybody here in this talk. So thank you for for coming here to NJIT and share with you the knowledge you accumulated over a number of years. And now I think the floor is open for questions. So I'm sure people will have a number of questions, but let's try to be somewhat organized and see what can we do. Yes, Tony.
You showed the E. coli moving, and then it was seeding the wall, the trajectory. What do you mean by seeding the wall?
So E. coli is a bacterium. Its flagellum is the rigid helical shape, like a corkscrew. When you rotate a corkscrew, you induce a hydrodynamic translation along the length of the corkscrew. So that idea is why E. coli, when far from boundaries, and it rotates its slender flagellum, will translate in a straight line. Okay, now you do this near a wall. Near a wall, you need to maintain torque balance on the bacterium. The way the bacterium maintains torque balance when it rotates its flagellum is its large head counter-rotates slowly the other way to maintain torque balance. When this object is near the wall and the flagellum trying to turn, the head, which is close to the wall, is counter-rotating. So you should think about now a sphere rotating close to a wall, and so it will roll along the wall. So now you have a translation along the axis and a translation perpendicular, and you get a slow drift along the wall. This was first pointed out by Howard Berg and Linda Turner in the 70s experimentally, and my group with Eric Laughlin was one of the first to try to rationalize why this happens. And someone last night at dinner, and we mentioned George Whiteside's, his group tried to use this idea to separate organisms by their size because of the radius and curvature they might have when they swim near walls.
Okay.
Gennady.
If I may ask a more pedagogical question. So, similarity solutions are beautiful.
I think he's about to punish me for something I said, so we'll find out.
But I don't think they're generally taught in any of the courses. Correct me if this is not the case. Maybe some of my colleagues are introducing it. Well, in math department, okay, I'm in chemical and well,
not true.
Yeah, not true, my friend.
okay, so if students don't know them, that doesn't mean they're not taught. But my question is the following: what do you think would be the right way to introduce them? Because they're not universal, right? There are only specific problems you can find a similarity solution for, right? It's a very narrow set of problems. So how do you pitch it to students? Like why they're important?
So I think you said they're not universal. What if I were to try to argue if you ask a certain kind of question, they may be universal? For example, the example I gave, which was a diffusion problem, that's a lot of problems. In pharmacy, the way a crystal will dissolve. In a vapor phase transport problem, the way a vapor leaves the surface. And the way I solved the problem, I didn't solve it, the way I tried to introduce the problem was by sketching a solution curve, by encouraging people to think intuitively about what does it mean for something to diffuse. I don't think that's how I teach it, because I don't think that's a bad thing to do, because many of us are uncomfortable with the mathematics when we see it for the first time. And so I might say it's, okay, universal might be too strong a word, but lots of problems then that have diffusion at early times don't know about the other walls. So at early times, they have to look like this at almost every scale because they don't see the whole geometry. So I might argue, okay, it's not the answer to every problem, but it helps you think about how things get established and how long it might take to get established. And I don't think that's a bad intuitive thing to try to encourage young people to think about, because when they problem solve in the real world, they often have to make estimates. You're allowed to disagree, but
Actually, you can keep it.
Okay.
Microphones.
Thanks, Howard, for that stimulating lecture. I'd like to take you back to some of what Weiss's group had done in the 90s and in some of the work. And thinking in terms of the edge effect that you're introducing as a chemist. So if I have, molecules or particles floating through, what is the effect on the edges with my chemistry, with my particles? If I think in terms of diffusion.
I think it's a great question, but I think I did mention that we stumbled on this solution. It is an edge effect. Since then, I've been trying to find other problems of this type where some analysis might be useful. I haven't really succeeded in that. I haven't thought about the problem that you've pointed out, that there could be other kind of particle transport problems. So I don't really have a good answer other than I think there's something about this style of problem that may lead to quantitative thinking, even though it looks so complicated that you might say nothing can be done. But the fact that there's an edge and a corner, at least we have one example, I know one other one, but there are not many, where something can be done. So I'd like to think that it might give you a way to think about other problems. But you're raising you're asking physical questions that I haven't thought about. And the one or two I have thought about, I didn't succeed in, but that it didn't mean I can't share with you guys what I did succeed in. So, yeah, but I think it's a good question. I've been trying to find other problems where one can make progress even though the geometry looks terrible.
Yes.
Howard, great talk. Question. The thinning on the vertical wall. So there were two parts of that I wanted to ask you about. There were two parts of the drainage on the vertical wall. First is a more complicated question about contact line motion, and that seems to be absent from the analysis.
Completely
maybe from-
absent.
Maybe from the experiments
Yeah.
as well. And then the similarity transform, which went through and worked for this problem when you introduced the transverse direction. It, it looked like it was linear in Y, but the shape of this thing was anything but linear as you got.
No, no, it only looked linear in Y because if you, the distance normal to the wall is what you would call the boundary layer thickness. And so in any boundary layer problem, you always pick the variable you're interested in, and then it gets normalized by other things to tell you how that boundary layer changes. And so it was written as linear in Y. That was just because it's a variable. But in the denominator was x to a funny power and t to a funny power. And so it was telling you that as you walk along the edge, you saw this blue rim change in time and space, and that's because it's effectively a boundary layer developing. Y just happens to be the way we wrote the independent variable, but the function wasn't linear.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? We're sort of running out of time. I think we have probably some kind of a limit, but let's see if we can accommodate maybe one or two questions at the most. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is about the T-junction problem. So one of the motivations is biological, right? So
Well, there were no motivations. That happened by accident because we were doing some work to answer a question from the plasma physics laboratory who was looking at a water system for one of their reactors. And so we set up a model experiment. So it's not like we were planning to look at that problem per se, but one day air got stuck in the system and it did something completely opposite what we thought. And then we asked why.
so I guess if you were to imagine a biological application, right, like in your arteries or
Oh,
something
sure.
like that.
Yeah.
So there we have oscillatory flow, right? So the flow would go back and forth. How do you think that picture would change if you were to, let's say, put in an oscillating flow at along two of the legs?
It's a great question. So the question is, in this trapping, what happens if it's an oscillatory flow? So I should go back and read my own paper. I think we either commented on, I've gotten this question before, and I think when the oscillation frequency is slow, you still see this trapping. When the oscillation frequency is sufficiently high or the flow is turbulent enough, you can break it up. But otherwise, you have a new scale, and so you can expect some things to change. But what I'm pretty sure is we did characterize at least slow frequencies, and it didn't affect it. Now, what I mean by slow, I don't have a good answer to.
Thanks.
Thank you. One more question? Yes, please.
I don't know if
Wait.
it was,
You can.
I don't know if this was mentioned in the slides, but for both the problems of the cylinder and you're making the liquid go up and the edge effect problem, did you guys like what liquid or material did you use? And and also as a secondary question, did you guys simulate multiple different liquids, or did you guys only do with one specific?
Okay, so we use different liquids in these systems, but the beauty of fluid mechanics is the question isn't about the liquid. The question is about relative rates. So the question you have to ask is, are the frictional effects in the fluid more important, or are the inertial effects in the fluid more important? So the only feature of the fluid we needed in those problems is that the fluid had to like the solid, and a physical chemist would say it's a wetting liquid. After that, it doesn't matter, just so long as the flow is not too fast in those two cases. And not too fast in this case means the Reynolds number is sufficiently low. So in most fluid mechanics problems, it's not a question about scale. It's not a question about material. It is a question about some dimensionless parameter. In this case, it has more to do with a low enough Reynolds number. But after that, everything else doesn't matter.
Fine. One more question then. Since I leave.
Yes, back to the T-junctions problems. And I guess that flow coming from the top to the bottom, and that's the gravitational directions. What if we
No,
flip?
no, no, sorry,
Is-
I should have clarified that. In the T-junction problem,
Mhm.
gravity didn't play a role. It was true there were bubbles, and bubbles are less dense than water, but
Mhm.
how the pipe was oriented didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that the object was less dense than the fluid, and the fluid was having to turn a corner. So it turns out in this situation, because the systems were millimeter scale, centimeter scale, gravity doesn't play a role. Density difference plays a role, but
Density.
not gravity.
Okay, thank you.
Have the microphone again, maybe one more, two. Okay. You can have this. Now, I said no more questions, but I always reserved the last question for myself. I have. So, obviously, the problems that you tackle are fascinating to begin with, and use the Navier-Stokes equation in many cases to solve them. But you always, at least to the best of my understanding, work with low Reynolds number, at least low Reynolds enough, no, low enough Reynolds number. Have you ever considered, of course, the problem that is associated with turbulence that, yesterday you referred to Lamb as a gigantic problem?
I mean, for me, I can answer it simply no. I never have. I think a long time ago, I'm not the most confident person in certain problems, and I saw this problem have being studied, the turbulence problem, by many distinguished people, and I'm not that strong statistically in turbulence. I think to make quantitative progress, whether experimentally or theoretically, you need to have a good understanding and comfort with statistical ideas. I never felt the attraction to that. And the thing I find so interesting about low Reynolds number flows is you get to meet scientists from every other field, molecular biology, chemistry, physics, because the problems involve materials, the problems involve elasticity, the problems come up in many cases. And so for me, the beauty of the field was I didn't feel ever the need or desire to study turbulence because people said it was this great unsolved problem. For me, it was just this complicated problem. I didn't have any intuition for it. And I think we all, in every field we work in, I think we all pick directions that we feel comfortable with internally, whatever that is. And so for me, it seems complicated to me. It seems interesting. I don't have any expertise in it, and I don't pretend to have any expertise. But I did work on a problem where the Reynolds number was 1,000, and we did find something new. So, yeah, but it's a great question. But I think my personality was such, and my insecurities were such that I never thought it was something I
and I
could
want to
do.
put you on the spot. I'm not saying that you should have started turbulence. But at least for what I do, turbulence appears everywhere. So I need to account for that. Anyway, sorry, Cam.
So does fluid mechanics.
So I think we better come to a close with this very nice event. So for those of you who have been here before, again, this is one additional fascinating lecture in this series, and hopefully we'll keep maintaining the levels at the high level that we have already. And with this, I'd like to close the session and thank once again Professor Stone.
Thank you.
That's how I made it.
And the thing is, the east part of it